The door crashed open with such force that I thought it might fly off its hinges. Before I could even register what was happening, my best friend Ethan barged into the apartment, looking ghostly pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. He staggered inside, collapsing onto the couch like he'd just sprinted 5 miles. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest from the shock of his sudden appearance. "What the hell's going on?" I asked, my breath short as I tried to catch up. Ethan didn't respond right away. He kept rubbing his face with shaky hands, his eyes wide and unfocused, like he couldn't even process whatever had just gone down. "You won't believe this," he finally muttered, his voice barely a rasp. He hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, head hanging as if he couldn't bring himself to look up. "I screwed up, man. Bad. Really bad." The air in the room grew heavy, like I was suffocating. I had never seen him like this, not after all the years we'd spent together. Whatever had happened was serious. "Talk to me, Ethan," I pressed, sitting down across from him. "What's going on?" Just then, the door creaked open again, this time far more quietly. I turned to see my stepmom Sophie walking in. She was supposed to be staying for the weekend, but the whole situation was already off-kilter. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something. An understanding, a quiet knowing, that made my gut twist. She glanced at Ethan and me, her lips curling into a small, almost unreadable smile. Ethan's body tensed, his eyes locking with hers for what felt like an eternity. "Is everything all right in here?" she asked, her voice smooth and casual, as if she hadn't just walked in on what felt like a complete meltdown. I didn't know how to answer. The atmosphere in the room was thick, the kind of tension you could almost feel pressing down on you, but I didn't know how to name it. The silence that followed her question hung in the air like a thick fog. I looked at Ethan, hoping he'd break the quiet with something, anything, but he just sat there, staring at his hands as if they were the only thing keeping him grounded. Sophie took a few more steps into the room, her heels clicking lightly on the wooden floor, and settled onto the couch next to Ethan, way closer than I would have expected. It was obvious she wasn't clueless about the situation. She knew something. The way she moved, the way she looked at us, it was all deliberate. She placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder, gentle, almost tender. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice low but oddly soothing. "You're not acting like yourself. What's going on?" Ethan's head snapped up, confusion and something else flashing across his face, though he didn't pull away from her touch. It almost seemed like her hand steadied him, even if just for a moment. Sophie had this unsettling ability to control the room with barely a word or movement. It was the kind of power you couldn't ignore, and I didn't like it. "Nothing. It's nothing," Ethan finally mumbled, his voice shaking as he tried to brush off whatever was going on. He looked at me, almost pleading for a way out, but then his eyes quickly darted back to Sophie, who hadn't moved a muscle. "Nothing?" she repeated, her hands still resting lightly on his shoulder. "You don't seem all right, Ethan." Then, like something snapped, the tension in the room exploded. Ethan turned toward her, his face barely an inch from hers. The movement was almost automatic, like he was being pulled in by some invisible force. Their faces were so close now that I felt like I shouldn't be there, like I was witnessing something I had no right to see. Before I could even react, their lips met. It wasn't aggressive, not forceful, but slow, almost like a decision being made in real time. Ethan didn't pull back. He leaned in, his hand awkwardly grasping her wrist, unsure whether to stop or keep going. The kiss lasted a little too long, and I couldn't look away. It wasn't about passion or desire. It felt more like a line being crossed, something unspoken that neither of them had anticipated breaking. I wanted to shout, to snap them both out of whatever this was, but my words got stuck in my throat. My mind raced, trying to understand what I had just witnessed, but it was like trying to grasp fog. Sophie pulled away first, her face completely unreadable, like the kiss hadn't affected her at all. She looked at Ethan the same way she had when she came in, calm, composed, but there was something different in her eyes now. Ethan, though, looked dazed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He turned toward me, his face flushed with panic. I could see the regret flooding in, but it was too late to undo any of it. He started, but his words trailed off, the sound hollow, like he didn't even believe what he was trying to say. I stood up, feeling the need to move, to distance myself from this mess, but I was frozen. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Sophie, unaffected, got to her feet and walked over to the window. She didn't look back at either of us. Her back was to us now, her reflection in the glass showing only composure. "We could all use some air," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan sat there, head in his hands, breathing hard. I had no words for him. Nothing I could say could undo what had just unfolded. A tight knot formed in my chest, the realization hitting me that this was only the beginning of something far beyond my control. Something that none of us could stop. But still, no one moved. The rest of the night dragged on in a suffocating silence. After that kiss, it was like none of us knew how to behave. Ethan sat still on the couch, his head bowed low, while Sophie remained near the window. Her back was to us, but I could feel the weight of her presence in the room. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound, each tick stretching longer than the last. I cleared my throat, the harsh noise breaking the stillness. "I think we should call it a night," I said, my voice stiff and tight, like the words were being forced out. I had no clue what else to say. What could I say? What had just happened wasn't something we could sweep under the rug. Ethan lifted his gaze, his eyes red-rimmed, and gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but enough to show he was on the same page. He didn't have the energy to speak. Slowly, as if every movement took too much effort, he got to his feet. He didn't look at Sophie again, muttering something about needing to leave, but just as he reached the door, Sophie turned around. Her face was calm, controlled, as though the kiss hadn't just shattered the world around us. "Ethan, are you sure you're okay to drive?" she asked, her voice smooth and unaffected. It made my skin crawl. How could she act like nothing was wrong? Ethan paused, uncertainty crossing his features, before he turned back to her. "I'll be fine," he muttered, his eyes avoiding hers. It was clear he just needed to get away. Couldn't blame him. The air felt thick with everything unsaid, and staying in that room was like suffocating. I walked him to the door, wanting to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but nothing came. Neither of us had the words. We exchanged an awkward glance, and then he was gone, vanishing into the night. I closed the door behind him, and when I turned, Sophie was still standing by the window, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The silence between us stretched on, heavy, suffocating. "I don't know what that was," I finally blurted out, my voice laced with frustration, betraying just how shaken I was. "But it can't happen again." Sophie didn't respond right away. She just watched me, like she was weighing what to say. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't plan for it to happen either," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you need to understand, this isn't just about tonight." Her words hung in the air, leaving more questions than answers. I took a step toward her, my heart hammering. "What does that mean?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Sophie sighed, her eyes drifting back to the window. "It means things are already more complicated than you realize." She glanced at me from the corner of her eye, her expression composed, almost cold. "And you need to be ready for that." I stood there, trying to process what she just said. What was she implying? I didn't get it, or maybe I didn't want to. I didn't want to accept that this was only the start of something bigger, something out of our control. Sophie walked past me, heading toward the stairs. "Get some rest," she said, her voice calm, almost too gentle. "We can talk more tomorrow." I watched her go, a storm of emotions brewing inside me. Anger, confusion, disbelief. The night had gone from ordinary to something I couldn't even recognize, and I had no idea how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with her. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The next morning, I woke up to a suffocating stillness. Felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The events of the previous night lingered over me like a dark cloud I couldn't escape. I stayed in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The kiss, the tension between Ethan and Sophie, the words she had left me with. It all felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Eventually, I dragged myself out of bed. I couldn't hide from this anymore. There was no running away from it. I headed downstairs to the kitchen, where I found Sophie already sitting at the table, sipping her coffee as though nothing had happened. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything, but it felt wrong, like the light was mocking the heaviness inside me. "Morning," she said casually, her voice too normal, like we were still living in some version of reality that made sense. I muttered a response, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting across from her. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the cup to my lips. I couldn't put this off any longer. I had to address it. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. Sophie didn't flinch. She simply placed her coffee down and folded her hands on the table in front of her. "I figured you'd say that," she replied calmly. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since last night, I saw something different in them. A flicker of uncertainty, a crack in her otherwise controlled exterior. "What happened last night?" I began, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know what it was, but it can't happen again. None of it. The kiss, Ethan leaving like that, is all wrong." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "And why is it wrong?" I blinked, caught off guard by her question. "Why?" "Because you're my stepmother, Sophie. Because Ethan's my best friend. And what happened between you two crosses a line that shouldn't even exist." She nodded slowly, as if taking in what I said. "I understand," she replied finally, her tone softer now. "But what you don't seem to realize is that lines only exist if we choose to believe in them." I stared at her, completely at a loss for how to respond. Was she suggesting we could just pretend it never happened? That it didn't matter? "I'm not trying to make excuses," she continued. "I know how this looks," Sophie began, her voice calm, but her words were loaded with something I couldn't quite decipher. "But Ethan was in a really vulnerable place last night. He wasn't himself, and maybe, just maybe, I wasn't either." I set my coffee down, the bitter taste still lingering, making my stomach churn. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter, almost hesitant, as if I was bracing for something I didn't want to hear. Sophie leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "That depends on you, and on Ethan," she said, her tone steady. "I'm not going to force anything, and I'm not going to pretend nothing happened. But we have to face it. The question is how." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog clouding my thoughts. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what the right move was. Everything felt too complicated, tangled in emotions I wasn't sure I even wanted to acknowledge. Before I could say anything more, a knock at the door startled both of us. The sound hit the air with an almost physical weight. Sophie turned to look toward the door, and I felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. I already knew who it was before I even opened it. There, standing in the doorway, was Ethan, looking worse than the night before. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair disheveled, and there was a hollow look about him, like he hadn't slept at all. He didn't say a word as I stepped aside, allowing him in. His movements were stiff, like he didn't really want to be there, but didn't know where else to go. Sophie stayed seated at the table, her face completely expressionless as Ethan sank into the chair across from her. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice hoarse and raw, echoing the exact same words I'd just spoken minutes ago. Sophie nodded, her gaze unflinching, steady as always. "I know." I watched them, feeling more like an outsider than ever, completely lost in the dynamics unfolding before me. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to me, then back to her. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice cracking as the words slipped out. Sophie leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said, her voice soft, almost soothing. "We'll figure it out together." Her words sent a chill down my spine, though I wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else. Relief, maybe. Ethan seemed to relax a little, but the weight of last night was still there, just a little less suffocating. For a few moments, none of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken thoughts, a tension that refused to lift, like a cloud hanging low over the room. No one knew how to break the silence, and I could feel it, the fear of what was coming next, the uncertainty of where this would all go. Even as we sat there in silence, it was clear that nothing was truly resolved. I kept glancing between Ethan and Sophie, wondering what they were thinking, what they were hiding beneath their calm exteriors. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't do anything to stop this from spiraling out of control. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flickering to Sophie and then back down to the table, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He seemed to be fighting with himself, every word he wanted to say getting caught in his throat, and when he tried to speak, nothing came out. Finally, I broke the stillness. So what are we supposed to do now? My voice was tight, strained, like I was trying too hard to act like I was in control. But I wasn't. None of this felt manageable anymore. Sophie didn't flinch. She met my eyes, her expression unreadable. I think we need to take a step back, she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. We all need time to figure out what this means. Ethan repeated, his voice cutting through the tension. What this means? It doesn't mean anything, Sophie. What happened last night? It was a mistake. His hands were clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white from the strain. This is all wrong. Sophie tilted her head slightly, observing him. Is it? She asked, her voice soft but probing. Are you sure it's just a mistake? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched, and he turned his face away, staring out the window. I could see the conflict playing out across his features, the struggle within him. And that's when it hit me. Ethan wasn't just reacting out of guilt or confusion. There was something more. Ethan, what are you trying to say? The words slipped out before I could stop them, my voice shaky. He didn't meet my eyes. I don't know, he whispered, barely audible. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I can't get it out of my head. My stomach twisted, the realization settling deep in my chest. He wasn't just talking about regret. He wasn't just confused about what had happened. He was haunted by it. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving him. It's okay to be confused, Ethan, she said softly, her voice gentle. But you need to be honest with yourself and with me. Ethan flinched at her words but remained silent. The tension between them, the weight of whatever was unsaid, was suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. This isn't healthy. I blurted out, my frustration boiling over. We can't just sit here and pretend like everything is going to work itself out. We need to address this. All of it. Now. Sophie's eyes shifted to me, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker behind her calm demeanor. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And what exactly are we addressing? She asked, her voice low, almost predatory. What is it that you think needs to be resolved? The way she said it made me hesitate. I searched for the right words, but nothing came. Everything I wanted to say felt tangled up in my own emotions. Before I could respond, Ethan stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. I can't do this, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I need to get out of here. Ethan, wait, I called after him, but he was already halfway to the door. He didn't stop, didn't turn around. I watched him leave, disappearing out the front door, and just like that, I was alone with Sophie again. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned to face her, my heart pounding. You need to stop, I said quietly, my voice shaking. Whatever you're doing, you need to stop. She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, watching me with those same unreadable eyes. Slowly, she rose from her chair and walked over to the window, gazing out at the driveway where Ethan had just left. You don't understand, Sophie murmured, almost to herself. It's not that simple. I stood there, frozen in place, unsure of how to process what she just said. What do you mean? I finally asked, my voice quieter, like I was afraid of the answer. Sophie turned to face me, her expression softening, though there was something guarded in her eyes. I mean, none of this is what you think it is, she said. Her words sent a cold shiver down my spine. For a moment, I had no idea how to respond. I didn't know if I wanted to hear any more of it. The house was unnervingly silent after Ethan left, the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest, making it feel hard to breathe. I stood there, lost in thought, trying to make sense of Sophie's cryptic statement. None of this is what you think it is. What did she mean by that? Was she playing some game, or was there more to this than I could see? I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping through my fingers, something I didn't understand yet. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them. The hours stretched on, and before I knew it, I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing a glass absent-mindedly. I replayed the events of the last day in my mind over and over, trying to piece it all together. The kiss, Ethan's reaction, Sophie's strange words. Everything felt like part of a larger puzzle I couldn't solve. Then, I heard the soft click of heels behind me. I turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame. Her expression, as always, was unreadable. But there was something different in the air now. The sunlight streaming through the window cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel surreal, like we were both trapped in some strange, suspended moment. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but with a new edge of urgency that hadn't been there before. She crossed the room with a few strides, closing the distance between us. I set the glass down, drying my hands on a towel, and faced her. "Yeah, we do," I agreed, though I wasn't sure where to start. "What's going on, Sophie? You said things aren't what they seem. What does that even mean?" She sighed and folded her arms across her chest. "It means you're only seeing part of the picture," she said, her voice measured. "You're focusing on what happened last night. But there's more to it than that. More than you realize." Frustration boiled up inside me. "More? This isn't some puzzle, Sophie. Ethan kissed you. You kissed him back. That's what happened. There's nothing else to it." Sophie stepped closer, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You think that's all it was? A kiss? You really believe it's that simple?" Her challenge hit me like a slap, and I felt my patience start to snap. "Then explain it to me," I shot back, my voice rising. "Because right now, none of this makes sense." There was a long pause, the tension between us thickening, suffocating. Finally, Sophie took another step forward, so close now that I could see the subtle rise and fall of her breathing. Her eyes searched mine, as if weighing how much to reveal. "You're right," she said softly, almost too softly. "It wasn't just about the kiss. It's about something deeper, something that's been building for a long time. And you've been part of it, too." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I didn't understand. What did she mean I was part of it? Before I could process anything, Sophie reached out, her hand brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was simple, yet it sent a jolt through me, as if it carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us. I stepped back instinctively, putting some space between us, but the kitchen suddenly felt smaller, like there was nowhere to escape. "Are you trying to manipulate this?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Are you trying to twist it into something it's not?" Sophie shook her head, her expression softening slightly. "No, I'm not twisting anything," she said calmly. "I'm just telling you the truth, whether you're ready to hear it or not." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to keep pushing, to demand more answers. But another part of me, maybe the smarter part, was terrified of what I might uncover if I kept asking. "I don't want to play games," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "I just want to understand what's happening here. With you, with Ethan, with all of this." Sophie studied me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "It's not a game," she said softly. "It's never been a game." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. I felt the tension building again, but this time it felt different. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us could control. Before I could stop myself, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since the night before. "Do you regret it? What happened with Ethan?" Sophie looked away for a moment, her expression unreadable again, before she met my eyes once more. No, she said, her voice steady. I don't regret it. But I also don't expect you to understand that. Her words hung in the air between us, and I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down I wasn't sure I could. The room fell into silence again, and I realized that whatever came next was going to change everything. Nothing would be the same after this conversation. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. The weight of her words pressed down on me as I stood there in silence, my chest tight. I couldn't process everything she'd said, but the reality of it was starting to sink in. Sophie hadn't moved. She stood there, her gaze fixed on me, waiting for some kind of reaction. But what could I say? That I was angry? Confused? I was both. But the deeper truth was something I wasn't ready to face. I turned away. I gripped the edge of the counter, my hands tight, as if holding on to something solid would steady me. The silence between us was suffocating, thick with all the words we hadn't said, all the things we couldn't say. It felt like the air had become too dense, making it hard to breathe. I don't know how we got here, I muttered, more to myself than to her. My voice was distant, as if it wasn't even mine, like I was hearing someone else speak. I do, she replied softly, and those two words pierced the quiet, sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to regain control. But control felt like a distant dream, something unreachable, slipping further from my grasp. When I opened my eyes again, Sophie had moved closer. I hadn't even noticed how close she'd gotten until she was right in front of me. The small space between us was suddenly filled with her presence, an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. In that moment, it wasn't about right or wrong. We had already crossed too many lines for those labels to mean anything. Or maybe thinking had become too difficult. I reached for her. It was a reflex, a momentary lapse in judgment that I couldn't pull back from. My hand brushed lightly against her arm, and in that instant, everything shifted again. She didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped a fraction closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. And before I even realized what was happening, her lips met mine. This kiss was different. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was slow, deliberate, as if we both understood exactly what this moment meant, even if neither of us was ready to admit it. I don't know how long we stood there, but when she finally pulled away, the room felt impossibly still. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, everything seemed frozen in place. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes now, something I hadn't seen before. Neither of us spoke. What could we say? Words felt too small, too weak to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Instead, we stood there, swallowed by the silence. The weight of the situation hung over us like a heavy blanket. I took a step back, breaking the invisible thread that had held us so close together. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had just occurred. But one thing was certain. We had crossed a line, and that line could never be uncrossed. Sophie exhaled softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. You understand now, don't you? I didn't know what she meant by that. Did I understand? No. But I couldn't ignore the undeniable truth. Things had changed between us, in a way that couldn't be undone. I need to go, I said, the words slipping out faster than I intended. I needed space, air, something to clear the chaos in my head. I couldn't stay in that room with her any longer without everything collapsing in on itself. But before I could make it to the door, it swung open, and there was Ethan, standing in the doorway. His eyes flicked from me to Sophie, and something passed across his face, something I couldn't quite place. He had seen enough. Whatever had transpired between us in those brief moments was clear to him. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with an unbearable tension. I came back to talk, Ethan said, his voice flat, emotionless, but his eyes were locked on Sophie, and for a second, I thought he might say something more. Something that would shatter the fragile balance we were all clinging to. Instead, he stepped inside, the door clicking softly shut behind him. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence was enough to make everything feel even more surreal. Sophie straightened, her expression still unreadable, but I could tell something had shifted in her too. She crossed her arms lightly across her chest, watching Ethan with that same quiet intensity. "We can talk," she said, her voice calm, but the underlying tension was undeniable. "But we need to be honest with each other." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward. "Yeah. We do," he replied, his tone sharp. "But are you ready for that?" It was clear from the way he spoke that this conversation wasn't going to end well. The air between us grew heavier, more suffocating with each passing second. Ethan's words hung in the room like an anchor, weighing us all down. None of us could escape it. Sophie stood across from him, her calm demeanor starting to crack under the pressure of whatever was about to unfold. I could feel it too, the storm building, and I wasn't sure any of us were ready for where it was going. Ethan didn't sit down. He remained standing, his arms crossed, his eyes shifting between Sophie and me. His gaze, once filled with confusion and vulnerability, was now steely hard, like he'd finally made up his mind about something. I saw the change in him, and it made my stomach twist. "You think you can just manipulate us, don't you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "You've been playing us against each other," Ethan said, his voice steady but thick with anger. "Like none of this matters. Like we won't figure it out." Sophie's eyes flickered, a spark of something I couldn't place, but she didn't respond immediately. Her silence felt intentional, like she was waiting for him to say more, something that was inevitable. And maybe she was right to wait, because when Ethan spoke again, his words hit me harder than I expected. "I've known for a while," Ethan continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I just didn't want to believe it. But last night it all clicked. I was still trying to process everything." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding distant, like it wasn't mine. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't sure why. Ethan glanced at me for a brief moment, but his focus quickly returned to Sophie. "You've been pulling us both into this mess for your own reasons," he went on, ignoring my question entirely. "But here's the thing, Sophie. You're not the only one who knows how to play this game." Sophie's expression remained unreadable, but I saw her hands tense, her fingers curling slightly where they rested at her sides. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" she asked, her voice steady but with a slight tremor that betrayed a hint of unease. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You know exactly what I'm accusing you of," he said, his tone dripping with frustration. "You've been messing with us, using us to fill whatever void you've got going on. But it's not just about us, is it?" My mind raced, struggling to follow the twists and turns of the conversation. This wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and I felt like I was missing pieces of a story. "What are you talking about?" I asked again, my voice louder this time, frustration bubbling over. But it felt like I was just an observer, standing in the background as they carried on with their private battle. Ethan finally turned to me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't decipher. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice softer now, almost pitying. "She's been pulling us both along. But for what? For her own satisfaction? Or is there something deeper going on here?" I looked at Sophie, hoping for some kind of denial, some explanation that would make sense of this mess. But she just stared back at me, her silence louder than any answer she could have given. And that's when it hit me. There were things she hadn't told us, things we hadn't even asked about. Ethan stepped back, his expression grim. "I can't be part of this anymore," he said, his voice firm, final. "I thought I could figure it out, but whatever this is, it's too messed up." He turned toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. I wanted to stop him, to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight, my mind too scattered to form words. Just as his hand touched the door handle, he paused and looked over his shoulder, his gaze sharp. "If you're smart," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "you'll leave too. Before it's too late." With that, he was gone. The door clicked softly behind him, and the room fell into an unbearable silence. I stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of his departure pressing down on me. I turned to Sophie, desperate for some kind of explanation. I needed to understand what had just happened, what this all meant. But when I looked at her, I didn't see the woman I thought I knew. I saw someone with secrets, someone who had been hiding things from me. What did he mean? I asked, my voice shaking. What aren't you telling me? Sophie held my gaze, her face as calm as ever. But there was something in her eyes now. Something darker, something unfamiliar. There are things you're better off not knowing, she said quietly. Things that don't need to be spoken. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to demand answers, to force her to tell me everything. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else. I took a step back, the space between us suddenly feeling like an insurmountable gap. What are you hiding, Sophie? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, walking toward the window, her back to me as the sunlight filtered in through the curtains. In that moment, I realized something. Maybe I'd never get the full truth. The room felt impossibly still, heavy with the weight of the unspoken. The silence stretched on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed. I watched her standing there, and one thought echoed in my mind. Maybe some things were never meant to be understood.